You're listening to Frank Talks Pleasures and Lifestyles, and I'm Frank because I have to be. We're in studio with Nancy LeClerc. Hi Nancy, how you doing?
I'm alright, Frank. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. And we're continuing with our interview. So we're talking about bisexuality. Nancy is a representative of Unité Montréal. And my next question to you, Nancy, what are some of the obstacles that a bisexual person might face?
For starters, I would say that a lot of them are similar to the obstacles that a gay or lesbian person would face in terms of dealing with social taboos about sexual orientation, dealing with homophobia at large, or heterocentrism, which is the tendency that people have in the society to assume that everybody is heterosexual. In addition to that, there are certain obstacles I kind of alluded to before in terms of arriving in the queer community and finding out that even there are people who either believe that bisexuals don't exist, or that we are traitors, that we are in denial about being gay or lesbian, kind of all these stereotypes. So I guess if you put those two obstacles together and call it biphobia, you have kind of this sense of I wouldn't go as far as to call it hatred all the time, but this sense of dismay from both sides that, oh dear, they're breaking the norms.
So in other words, a bisexual doesn't belong with the straight people, but doesn't belong with the gay people either.
Well, I guess that's kind of a generalization, because like I said before also, it is getting better, so I don't want to put the queer community down, because it still provides a sense of home to a lot of bisexuals. But in a sense, I guess to a certain extent, we could say that sometimes we're made to feel as though we don't really belong anywhere.
What are some of the sacrifices that a person who is bisexual that wants to come out as a bisexual person would have to make?
I think, well, one of the that might change between males and females. Actually, there's some variation there as well. From some of my male bisexual friends, I think the main challenge is very similar to what gay men have to go through, because in North American society, female same-sex sexuality is more accepted, quote-unquote, than male same-sex interactions. So they have that whole kind of stigma to overcome, especially in diverse workplaces and social situations. Whereas for females, some people would think it's easier, but it's not necessarily, because then we have that whole thing of when we out ourselves as bisexual from heterosexual males, sometimes, not all, I don't want to generalize, but sometimes we get that reaction of, oh, cool, a bisexual woman. And from females, it might be like, slut, that brand slut. Not that that's a bad thing, but not everybody wants that label either. So it's the assumption. It's always the assumption. So I guess those are some. When you come out as bisexual, it's almost as though people think that when you're coming out, you're announcing your bedroom activities to everybody. In the meantime, heterosexuals wear wedding rings, and so they're outing themselves all the time and saying, my husband, my wife, this, but that's okay. Whereas as soon as you say you're bisexual, it's almost as if people assume you're saying it to shock them, or just to... It's kind of weird, in a nutshell.
I never even considered the fact that wearing a wedding ring is a display of sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
When in fact, it very much identifies you with a particular group.
Mm-hmm. Well, up until recently, that was a heterosexual privilege, and now you can have a wedding ring and be married to somebody of the same sex. So that's changing a little bit, except that people still will tend to associate it, I think, with heterosexuality for a few decades.
I'd like to go back to the topic of relationship structures.
Mm-hmm.
And the issue that a bisexual person is attracted to both genders,
mm-hmm.
and being with one gender in a monogamous relationship might mean that they have to give up experiencing the other gender, depending, of course, on the rules. Now, the topic of polyamory, being able to be involved with more than one partner, is a polyamorous relationship structure something very common amongst bisexuals?
I I'd hesitate to call it necessarily common because we need kind of some statistics to actually back that up, and we don't really have them. But I would say that it's definitely a recurring topic of conversation that comes up on discussion lists and discussion groups in informal settings, because a lot of people, when they start realizing that they're bi, will contemplate that and will ask themselves, do I have to be polyamorous to experience bisexuality? Is polyamory for me? And so, you know, some people, I mean, again, you have a whole bunch of different opinions. I've heard some bisexuals say that, oh yeah, you definitely need both when you're bi, that's what being bi is all about, so polyamory goes hand in hand with bisexuality, whereas you have other people who say, well, you know, you have heterosexual and homosexual polyamorists, so polyamory and bisexuality are two separate entities. One is sexual orientation and the other is relationship formation. So, but there's definitely a relationship. I mean, it comes back all the time in the discussions, so it's definitely a concern.
In the area of polyamory, you can have a situation where you'll have one woman with many husbands, or possibly many wives, or one husband with many wives, possibly many husbands. Are there terminology to describe the different relationship structures?
Well, I guess what you're talking about there with husbands and wives, I guess, is if we're talking about more formal arrangements, which is not something that we really have here in Canada. We don't have legalized multiple marriages, which is actually polygamy as opposed to polyamory. So people do tend to mix those two terms up, whereas polyamory is a relationship thing where it's not going to be formalized, at least not until we have laws that allow us to do so. But, you know, you definitely have places where polygamy does exist and that it's, you know, legally sanctioned and recognized, but that's kind of a whole other ball of wax. It's kind of more culturally ingrained institutions. So I guess there's even in the polyamorous community, you have all kinds of discussions about terminology and how do you label this and label that, and it's still relatively new, right? So people are still trying to define things and put names to them and look for models. So it's kind of tricky.
A good example of that would be, how do I define my girlfriend's boyfriend's lover who I'm also involved with?
Exactly. Yeah, it's you know, I guess we have this desire to put everything in boxes, and you know that our society is kind of built around, you know, creating boxes and writing something on the side of the box so that you can easily put things in them. But we're seeing more and more that with talk of bisexuality and transsexuality and transgenderism and polyamory, that it's just getting more and more complicated to try to create all these boxes. You need too many. So
isn't that one of the areas of resistance when it comes to topics of sexuality? Specifically because there really is no way to properly define it. It's something you have to experience as opposed to something you can just easily explain. And I'm wondering, do you think that there's a way to explain it to people better?
I'm not sure, because it's hard to explain things to people when you don't know exactly where they're coming from. A wise Cree man once told me that when he was trying to tell me about his culture, and so I find it relates to this situation as well. And I guess some of what you were saying, it does scare people when they can't put something in a box because they don't know how to relate to you, and if they look at you and they can't tell if you're male or female, they panic. If they look at you and they don't know if you're attracted to men or to women, they panic. When they look at you and they see that you have two partners and that you're open about it, they don't know how to relate to you, and it scares them. So it's really hard to explain things to people when they just put this wall between themselves and you, and the only way to really get people to understand is they have to remove that wall, and we can't really do that for them.